sustain regional integration, we have seen ECOWAS become more and more lenient with these countries. So now there is very little room for ECOWAS to assume that initial authoritative tone that it took with these countries, given that it is now coming to the table from, a compromise position. But what we continue to see in these countries is arbitrary killings, which are attended by impunity, and then there is the arrest and jailing of activists, political opponents, and the like. So now the major question that the sub-region should be asking is, in the wake of ECOWAS's bid to preserve regional integration across the sub-region, where does that leave the human rights question? How are we managing the two? In the 11 democracies that I spoke of in the sub-region, we continue to witness, a growing clampdown on the civic space and repression of freedoms and rights of association, because governments are increasingly trying to clamp down on, mechanisms for accountability. And we realize that in the Sahelian states, instead of the juntas actually safeguarding and protecting human rights, they are actually using the human rights to intimidate and make people cower. Because take the case of Burkina. The reason the junta gave for coming to power for ousting government was because government couldn't handle the terrorist insurgency. Now in the same Burkina, you criticize the junta for its inability to rein in the terrorist insurgency, and then you are sent to the war front. In Mali, you do the same, and then you risk being jailed. Quite recently, there was an incident involving one military officer, a very prominent one at that, who was jailed for some remarks which the government felt were not in their favor. So the key element that we see in all these trends is the abuse of power. And I like the fact that the report makes mention of, an incipient emergence of authoritarianism across the sub-region and the highly centralized structures of political systems across the sub-region, where power is consolidated heavily in the executive. If we take events in the sub-region into consideration, we'll realize that this high concentration of power in the executive underlies much of the abuse of power and the infringement of human rights and the attacks on human rights defenders that we witness across the sub-region. And currently, there are these agitations and contentions going on around constitutional reviews in the sub-region. We have one in Gambia, and there's another one in Nigeria, and there are others. But in all these cases, you realize that the key element of the contention has to do with government efforts to reserve for themselves disproportionate amounts of power. This has been the case recurrently. And as human rights advocates, yeah, it is true that our field has to do specifically with human rights, but it is very incumbent that we also begin to pay attention to some of these discussions on the Constitution, because ultimately, that is where the government that is going to try to repress you is going to draw that power from. The report mentions that human rights defenders find political parties to be the most abusive. So imagine the situation where you are equipping that same political party with a constitution that grants him all manner of liberty with you. So increasingly, there is something that human rights defenders need to appreciate, that the whole democracy ecosystem is something that needs to be addressed. We cannot just, limit ourselves to just that small space of human rights. It cuts across. Without human rights, what you have is clear instability, and it is something that we need to take care of. Now, regarding measures that we are supposed to take as human rights defenders, one key element I'll mention is that of solidarity. You cannot rule that one out. You cannot rule out the power and the significance of solidarity. We must always strive to find avenues within which we can support each other and within which we can also push forward each other's cause. And we should shun complacency. I often hear a lot that, oh, the situation in Burkina is way worse than the situation in Ghana. As for Ghana, we are safe. As for Nigeria, we are safe. Around 2014, when the terrorist insurgency in Nigeria was really at its peak, they conducted a census in Burkina and they asked Burkinabes whether they felt there will ever be a threat of terrorist insurgency in Burkina. At this time, Mali was the epicenter of the terrorist insurgency. 75 or thereabout of Burkinabes said